I'm Robert Polito from the New School Writing Program, and it's an immense pleasure and honor to welcome Gary Giddins to the New School. This is an event, as many of you know, that was originally scheduled for a snow day, now months and months ago, and is now taking place on this beautiful spring day. Gary writes many different kinds of books. He's the author of basically definitive biographies, like his biography of Bing Crosby, and very, very suggestive, pointed biographies, like his biography of Louis Armstrong. Many of his books are collections of his essays and reviews, notably Natural Selection, Weatherbird, Riding in a Blue Note, and most recently, Warning Shadows, the book that we're celebrating today, a collection of his pieces about classic cinema. And he's also the author of these large, compendious, comprehensive books of jazz history, like Rhythm, Aning, and Jazz. And I've come to think of Gary as somebody who does everything right. He seems to know everything. All of his books, his biographies, or his collections of essays and reviews, his histories, they're meticulously and imaginatively sourced and researched and edited. And he also possesses an extraordinary large vision of the connections between art and culture and between music and society. But I think the reason that I most value Gary as a writer is he writes these extraordinary sentences. I mean, for years, I kept his book, Natural Selection, next to my bed, and whenever I couldn't sleep, which is almost every night, I would open it up, and no matter where I opened it, whether it was to the section on movies or the section on music or the section on books, I would just find this one amazing sentence after another. And when I think of Gary, I think of the critics that I most admire. And for me, that would be people like Manny Farber or D.H. Lawrence, or in a different vein, Richard Poirier. And I think sentence by sentence and phrase by phrase and paragraph by paragraph, you won't find any critic in America more resourceful and inventive than Gary Giddins. So please join me in welcoming Gary, and he'll read a bit and we'll do some questions.
Thank you, Robert. That's quite an introduction. I can't wait to tell my daughter that I do everything right. I'm going to read two short pieces. The first is from my new book, Warning Shadows, which came out a couple of weeks ago. And it's mostly a collection of essays about cinema, classic films. And it begins with a kind of history of the way of exhibition, of the way movies are shown, and the way our perception of movies is influenced by the way they're shown. And I'm going to read the section on peep shows. Broadway snakes past 27th Street on one of New York's dodgier merchant strips. Though only a few blocks north of the splendidly open area that includes Madison Square Park and the insuperable Flatiron Building, Broadway narrows here, filtering the sun. The chock-a-block storefronts are long, oblong stalls, most serving as public entrees for wholesale import businesses operated from the offices above. A bazaar of party favors, souvenirs, designer knockoffs, cut-rate perfumes, scarves, caps, wigs, jewelry. It's an odd place to find a hotel, the Broadway Plaza, which now occupies 1155 Broadway. Its lobby entrance is constricted as that of the neighboring storefronts. No brass plaque adorns its facade to commemorate the event, and yet this particular site marks a significant episode in American cultural history. Here, on April 14, 1894, the commercial cinema was born. Thomas Edison had begun working toward the pictorial equivalent of his phonograph in 1887, having moved his operation to a plant in West Orange, New Jersey. He assigned the problem to his assistant, W.K.L. Dixon, who within 2 years produced a device that could capture and reproduce images from life. Nothing more at first than vague apparitions barely coalescing from the electrical ether, like warnings of life about to be born. Indeed, indeed the title Warning Shadows, appropriated from a little-remembered marvel of German expressionism made by an American director, Arthur Robeson, living in Berlin, alludes to a far older phenomenon, Plato's shadows in the cave, the eternal dichotomy between life as lived and projected. For what are movies but light and shadow thrown upon a wall? By 1891, those images had become startlingly distinct. Dixon waving his hat in welcome, an assistant sneezing, Eugene Sandow the muscle man flexing, dancers and boxers and circus performers cavorting, a blacksmith at work. Dixon designed a building to shoot films, the first movie studio, called the Black Maria, as dark and forbidding as from the outside as a paddy wagon. Celebrities postured in its darkness to win a new kind of immortality. Unable to project the images for a crowd, Edison perfected a peephole machine, which he called a kinetoscope or kinetograph. In 1893, his demonstration of the prototype enchanted a group of businessmen who lined up to look into the eyepiece and see moving pictures, fluid as life, a wondrous amusement in an age starved for amusement. Within a year, the Edison Manufacturing Company licensed the Kinetoscope Company, a subordinate syndicate, to distribute the first 25 models, 5 to Atlantic City, 10 to Chicago, and 10 to a vacated shoe store at 1155 Broadway. At that time, a neo-Grec 3-story building erected in the 1870s, it survived intact until the early 1990s, at the hub of New York's business and entertainment district. On Saturday, April 14, 1894, as other members of the syndicate lounged in the store smoking cigars, the brothers Andrew and Edwin Holland, who had worked with Edison on the phonograph, labored to get the place ready for the big opening on the following Monday. It's not hard, even now, to peer into the Broadway Plaza's entryway and imagine how it looked on that day. A bust of Edison in the window, floors waxed to a shine, 2 dragon-shaped incandescent lights hovering from the ceiling, the walls decorously lined with potted palms on pedestals, and in the center, 2 back-to-back banks of 5 kinetoscopes, guarded by brass rails. Unlike the earlier phonographic salons, which offered free entry and nickel machines, the kinetoscope parlor charged 25 cents admission, for which customers could lean over the rail and see, and peep at each of 5 moving pictures. For an additional quarter, they could see the other 5. The higher price signaled a desire for respectable clientele, including ladies. With all in readiness that Saturday, the men thought it would be a fine joke to admit the few gawkers milling outside and collect enough money to buy a fancy dinner. They had as well opened the door to Oz. The ever-escalating crowd kept them occupied until 1 a.m. In 1895, kinetoscope parlors flourished around the country. While attempts were made to liberate moving pictures from the wooden box and the isolating eyepiece, Edison would announce his Vitascope projector in 1896, but he had been beaten to the punch. In France, the Lumiere brothers, inspired by Edison, introduced a portable, hand-cranked camera called the cinematograph that could project images on a screen. In March of 1895, they gave a demonstration of footage taken at their factory. And on December 28th, they presented a 20-minute exhibition before 33 paying customers at what must be accounted the world's first provisional movie theater, the Indian Salon in the basement of Paris's Grand Café. That should have marked the fast demise of the peep show. The novelty was wearing off anyway, and neither Edison nor his increasing number of competitors could produce enough new and better films to draw crowds. Yet peep shows continued to dominate the new business for nearly a decade, now configured as coin-operated gizmos. The American Mutoscope and Biograph Company, which had recruited Dixon after he quarreled with Edison, played it both ways, screening and peeping. The premiere of the first all-biograph program was a triumph, complete with a Republican flag-waving demonstration to greet the image of its presidential candidate in Major McKinley at home. But the same company also introduced a rival to the kinetoscope, the coin-operated Mutoscope, a hand-crank machine in which each frame of film was printed on a separate card. Turning the crank was like thumbing the pages of a flipbook. As the flow of pictures could be manipulated, the mutoscope became associated with mildly salacious material. In effect, it offered the 1890s equivalent of slow-mo and fast-forward, and was immensely popular. Movie screenings, on the other hand, took place in various converted venues, usually as special events, and many people, especially women, were afraid to enter a dark room that was lighted only by a flickering image. Penny arcades decided the issue. They became a huge business as kinetoscopes and mutoscopes easily outperformed other mechanical diversions, fortune tellers, weigh scales, candy dispensers, boardwalk games, in well-lighted, well-appointed emporiums. Some of these arcades were operated by the very men who would later become Hollywood moguls. Yet no entrepreneur thought to open a dedicated motion picture theater in the United States until 1905, when John Harris and Harry Davis converted a Pittsburgh store, installing 100 seats and projecting an uninterrupted daily showcase of moving pictures in surroundings no less reputable than those of a vaudeville house. They charged a nickel admission, and they called the place a Nickelodeon. The movies had gone public. In 1907, the Saturday Evening Post estimated some 5,000 Nickelodeons in operation, entertaining 2 million customers per day, a third of them children. That same year, Edison hired D.W. Griffith as an actor, who insisted on using a pseudonym so as not to damage his prospective reputation on the stage. Still, the furtive kick of the peep show refused to die. The first time I saw Lon Chaney unmasked as the Phantom of the Opera was in a kinetoscope on Disneyland's Main Street. This was in 1961, when a penny was still worth the stooping, and penny arcades had not yet morphed into pinball outlets, let alone video-powered playlands. Shortly before that West Coast trip, I had found a marvelous penny arcade underground in the subway at 42nd Street and 8th Avenue. This arcade, which also sold 1940s and 1950s paperbacks and had machines that dispensed purplish-tinted, heavy stock cards of cowboy stars unknown to me and my friends, usually signed cordially Bob Steele, cordially Ken Maynard, offered a row of mutoscopes that cranked scenes from ancient westerns. Boring as they might have been on a 30-foot screen, they were made compulsive by the act of peeping. A few years later, we found other peep shows on 42nd Street. Women writhing on beds in their underwear, occasionally topless. This was the era of films about nudists playing shuffleboard, when true pornography was illegal, and the only use for cinema's first means of exhibition beyond Disneyland nostalgia relied on relatively innocuous voyeurism. Not even Edison could have imagined the trillions of nickels to be generated decades later by the brazenly ravenous appetites of peeping laptops. And, this is the book that Robert mentioned, Natural Selection. Shall I continue reading? Or? Yeah, okay. All right, this is from the introduction. It's it's autobiographical. What can I tell you? I hardly ever write autobiography, and it always makes me uncomfortable. And when I do it, I always do it in the introduction and insist that the introductory pages be numbered with Roman numerals because nobody reads introductions. I've actually had editors ask me questions, and I'll say, well, I wrote about that in the introduction. And they say, oh, well, I never read introductions. Only writers read introductions. The first part is called Intelligent Design. My first published film reviews appeared 1 month before my first published concert review. It happened in a roundabout way. I'd been knocking around New York for about a year, dutifully tying my tie and presenting my resume, which was 4 years as a recalcitrant undergraduate, at interviews that went nowhere, while collecting enough rejection slips from newspapers and magazines to insulate a Quonset hut. For a few months, I worked at a bookstore, but was fired for advising a customer who had bought many books on my counsel not to buy one. The record producer John Hammond, who I had met and corresponded with a year earlier, promised me a position at Columbia Records upon graduation. But he finally conceded, after having me visit his office almost daily for several weeks, that no such job existed. But would I like to write a liner note for an album by a marvelous rock guitarist? May I do it anonymously? If you prefer, what the hell? Columbia paid me, but happily for all concerned, decided not to use my strenuous blurb. I was more and less fortunate at RCA Victor, where a lovely woman whose name I am ashamed to have forgotten regularly gave me miscellaneous liner note assignments, most published pseudonymously. An inadvertent exception was More Golden Gems from the Carter Family. The author's credit reads, Mr. Giddins, a freelance writer from New York, has been a follower of the Carter family for many years. The part regarding New York was correct in that I was born in Brooklyn, but the rest was a stretch. And it dissuaded me from further hack work with or without attribution. In this spirit, I tentatively submitted to interviews with a personnel apparatchik at Time magazine, who, perhaps misinterpreting my anglicized name and rebounding from a multiple martini lunch, volunteered that he didn't have much use for Jews, and with a public relations executive who brusquely asked how I would sell his client's brand of pretzels, at which point a discontented Chiverian future passed before my eyes. Earlier that year, my father had made a comment that has never failed me as unimpeachable career advice. We had been waiting on the platform for the Long Island Railroad, which headed him, playing pinochle, to his company in the Garment Center, and me reading to another mislaid day on John Hammond's couch. He mentioned that a couple of my childhood friends had gone into their father's businesses at starting salaries that would be respectable today, 35 years later. I asked if it bothered him that I had never expressed any desire to follow in his line. He said that the trucking business had been good to him and provided him with a great life, yet he had never wanted me to have to associate with that element. He had in mind criminals with whom he was forced to deal, not news weeklies or pretzel flacks, but good advice is almost always flexible. Eventually, I presented myself to Dan Morgenstern, who at that time held the now non-existent position of Downbeat's New York editor, and was one of the writers I most admired in the world. Dan and I chatted about jazz, and after batting around a few possibilities, he suggested I review McCoy Tyner's trio with Slugs. He called to have me placed on the guest list. That evening, I was shown to a ringside table where I asked for a Jack Daniels and laid out before me with, I like to think, the panache of a surgeon assembling his instruments, a pen and pad. The patient arrived to enthusiastic applause. I recall nothing else except the drummer, who completely drowned out Tyner and my ambition. What I should have done, of course, is pick myself up and walk to the bar or another point in the room where the piano might have been audible, and the drummer less, shall we say, brawny. Instead, I called Dan the next morning and explained that I couldn't review a set I hadn't heard, nor did I want to make my debut with a fractious review of a musician I greatly admired. Maybe it was just a bad set. Should I go back tonight? Well, he couldn't get me in comped again. Chalk that one to experience. Fortunately, I had also convinced Dan to allow me to pursue a different kind of story. Charlie Mingus had just published a long-awaited autobiography, Beneath the Underdog, an extraordinary book, but also a puzzlement, because it in no way resembled the 1,000-page work in progress he had described in interviews. For one thing, it didn't include any of the stimulating excerpts that had been published over the years in magazines and on liner notes. Moreover, it contained the prominent credit edited by Nell King, with an auctorial note describing her as, quote, probably the only white person who could have done it, unquote. Mingus had been off the scene in the late 1960s, a difficult time for jazz. But publication of his book boosted his spirits, and he was about to bring a sextet into the Village Vanguard. Arriving early, I saw him standing alone under the awning and introduced myself. He said, or grunted, pleasantly enough, that he didn't want to talk about the book. So I listened happily to the band and wrote a review, my first, which I submitted to Dan. I can't recall now how I got Nell King's phone number, but she invited me to her apartment, which would have been spacious even if it had had furniture. It didn't, because she was moving to California that week. There were a few chairs, a sofa on which I set a tape recorder, and on the glossy wood floor, a portable record changer stacked with albums by Mingus and Dave Brubeck, both of whom Nell had worked with on her one-produced screenplay, All Night Long, a marvelous 1961 British jazz version of Othello, co-written with the blacklisted Paul Riggio. She was enthusiastic, gracious, informative, everything you want in an interviewee. There was only one problem. When I asked anything about Beneath the Underdog, she would motion for me to turn off the tape recorder. She did not mind telling me, but she didn't want this part to go into the article because it might upset Charles. I gave my word. After this happened half a dozen times, I threw in the towel, turned off the recorder, and listened to a score of anecdotes, none of which I could convey then or remember now. Chalk that one to experience, too. The next morning, Nell phoned to say that an old friend, Paul Clark, had been named the editor of The Hollywood Reporter and asked if she would be interested in reviewing movies. She wasn't, but she knew someone who might be perfect for the job. Was I interested? An avid film lover who had haunted movie theaters since childhood and all but camped out at the Thalia, New Yorker, and Museum of Modern Art, I first warmed to criticism as a discipline through the movie writings of Dwight MacDonald, and for 2 years had programmed a film series at college. I religiously checked off titles in Andrew Sarris's The American Cinema, determined to see them all, and read every small, overpriced volume from the Tantivity Press. Of course I was interested, though to be honest, at that point, if someone had offered me a post writing about wine, I would have considered all the Boone's Farm, Gallo, and checkered tablecloth Chianti I had quaffed and thought myself suited for that job as well. Paul Clark asked me to send 3 reviews. I attended a movie that afternoon and 2 more the next day and mailed in my musings. He approved and put me in touch with the New York editor who advised me of my first 3 screenings that week in January. I reviewed To Find a Man, X, Y, and Z, and Carry On Henry VIII, demonstrating a disdainful pomposity that justifiably gave Clark second thoughts. Yet he allowed me to continue. In writing for a trade paper, you review everything, including pictures that never found and did not merit a distributor, or were shunted in the ancient equivalent of straight-to-video to triple bills on 42nd Street. Watching them is torment. Writing about them corrodes the soul. Still, if the devil tells you he is confiscating 2 hours of your life and offers you the choice between spending them sitting through Pope Joan or burning in hell, you'd probably be wise to choose Pope Joan. Meanwhile, the February downbeat arrived with my accounting of Mingus at the Vanguard. Now that I was proud of. Other assignments followed, and pretty soon I was raking in the dough. $5 per review in The Hollywood Reporter, $7 per review in Downbeat. This went on for a year. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. That was great. Well, maybe we should start with that second piece.
Okay.
Was it really that serendipitous? The way you found yourself to criticism?
Yeah, I mean, the sentence that I passed over quickly about the rejection, not rejection slips, the paper at Quonset Hut, that was a year of rejection slips, and that was rough. It wasn't that rough, I have to admit, because I had acted a lot in college. And when I got out, just to keep myself busy, I was studying with a very good acting teacher in the West Village who thought I had some talent and kept getting me auditions. And every time I didn't get an audition, I would feel just crushed. But I never felt crushed about a rejection slip about my writing. And I think the difference was because I knew I wasn't an actor. I mean, if I'd gotten an acting gig, it would have been, lagniappe. It wasn't something that I thought I merited necessarily. Whereas the world was just going to have to accept the fact that I was a writer eventually, because I wasn't giving up. And, I just kept sending pieces and
they were all criticism that you were sending out?
Yeah, pretty much. I remember there was a rock magazine called Cream that had
out of Detroit.
Out of Detroit, and on the first page it said, "We accept, over-the-transom submissions. If you have anything, send it in." They wouldn't even publish, and that was for free. I mean, it was pretty disconcerting. But a girl I went to college with, during a few months after we all graduated, there was a party at her house. And I was pretty despondent at this point, and she said, "Come here," and she took me into her parents' bedroom. Her father was a very successful writer for Time Life. He was a food writer. And she said, "I want to show you something." And she opened up the bottom drawer of his desk. And in it was just a lot of pieces of paper, just loosely thrown in, some of them folded up. And I picked up a few. This guy, who at this point was probably my age now, had kept every rejection slip he ever got. And it was wonderful. I mean, it was just great. I thought, well, that's the way it works. You collect rejection slips, and then somebody publishes you, and then everything changes. The voice story is the most serendipitous of all, because I had met an editor at the time, not an editor, I had met a vice president of the New York Times. And by this time I had written quite a number of pieces for Downbeat and The Hollywood Reporter, and I freelanced a bit. And he liked my work, and he said, why don't you write a piece for the Times? And one thing I was very stubborn about, which I can't really say I regret now, but I wouldn't recommend it to writers getting started, but I refused to write on spec. You know that phrase, writing on speculation, you hope that it'll be said. I don't know, writing was too hard. I had to be paid. I didn't care what it was. It could be $10 or $7 is what I was getting. But I didn't like writing on spec. But this guy was at Times, and he was very enthusiastic. So I said, okay, I'll do it. So if I had met a guy in the record business who was about to release 2 albums 3 or 4 months down the road. So there was no way that anybody at the Times could have known about them or heard them. And he gave me test pressings, and I wrote this piece. And at that time, I was working as a copy boy at the New York Post, which was a very different paper then than it is now. You know, it was the paper that broke McCarthy. And I called from the city desk a couple times to ask him what happened with my piece. And first he said it was really good, and you know, he'd given it to the editor of Arts and Leisure, and don't worry, I'll get back to you. And after another week, I called, and then finally he called me back, and he said, look, John Wilson, who was the jazz critic at the Times then, you know, he read the piece, and he wants to review these 2 albums, and we can't really say no, he's our man. I said, you know, Peter, I don't care that much about it. I just want to know, would you really have published this? Was this really good enough for the Times? And he said, absolutely. So I said, would you please send it back? Because in those days, you know, you did everything on carbons. Mm-hmm. And so either I could retype my carbon, or, you know, he could send it back. So he mailed it back, and I put it into an envelope, a New York Post envelope, with a note handwritten to the music editor at The Voice. And I said, I didn't write this for The Voice, it was written for the Times, it's in the Times style, everybody's called Mr. Mm-hmm. I didn't really understand the Times style, because you don't call dead people Mr., but I did. It was Mr. Tatum, and it was... Mm-hmm. So a week later, I'm walking through the city desk at the New York Post, I mean literally 1 week later, and a copy girl named Sylviane Gold, who later went on to become a marvelous drama critic, ran over to me and she said, congratulations. And I said, for what? She said, I just read your piece in The Voice. I said, fuck. And I ran, I said, cover for me, and I ran downstairs and bought a Voice, and there it was. And she had never taken my calls in the past, and now she had to. So I called, she got on the phone, and I said, you know, how could you do that? I mean, and she said, well, a space opened up, and I really liked it. And they didn't change anything. It's the only piece ever to appear in The Voice in which everyone is referred to as Mr. And I said, well, am I getting paid? And she said, yes, absolutely. You'll get $90, which is big bucks for me. And I said, can I write for you regularly? And she said, well, I think we should meet. So I went up to The Voice. We made an appointment, and I got off the 4th floor elevator, and my people are wandering around. I don't know where I am, and I see a guy there, and it turned out to be the editor of the theater section. I said, I'm looking for Diane Fisher, and he knocked on her door and walked me in. And I have to emphasize here that this was 1973, and there was a desk, but mostly they were throw pillows. And she was wearing one of those, remember those granny dresses? You don't remember them, but these long dresses that went down to your ankles that looked like they were from the 19th century. And incense was burning on the windowsills. And so I took a seat, I took a throw pillow, and we sat and talked, and I knew what I wanted to do as a writer. I did not want to be a Times writer. I did not want to be a guy who has to go out 3-4 times a week and write little 300-word reviews. I wanted to write essays. And I told her, I said, what I want to do is a column. And she got really pissed. She said, you don't come in here and ask for a voice column. You have to earn a voice column. So I said, how do I do that? She said, well, you write for me, and we'll see what happens. So every week, I never saw her again for a year. The way it worked was you'd write a piece, put it in an envelope, and Sunday night put it through the mail slot at the Voice, which was locked. And there would be, 24 envelopes lying on the floor there. And every Sunday I would do that. I would write 2-3 pieces a week, and then I'd buy the Voice on Wednesday to see if they were used. And they were always used. So because I was writing so much for them, I started to get a reputation. And then she called me up, and there were rumors that Clay Felker was buying, it wasn't Clay, it was somebody before Clay was buying the Village Voice. And she said, when you first came to see me, I told you had to pay your dues to have a Voice column, and you have, and if I don't get fired, you'll have your column. She was fired the next morning. And then I got a call from Robert Christgau, who had just been hired to replace her. And all I knew about Bob Christgau was that he was a rock critic, of course, but the one thing I knew about him was that my senior year in college, he had written a piece for Esquire about how much he despised and loathed jazz. It just went on and on about how Miles Davis' music hasn't changed in 10 years. It was a foolish piece. And I thought, if Christgau's there's no way. I was married at the time to my first wife, and I said, I think it's over, my writing career. I'm going to have to get a real job. And Bob called me up, and he said, I'm the new music editor, and I'm firing all the columnists, but I would like you to write a column because you're the only one who's saying anything. So he said, let's meet, and Bob and I hit it off immediately, and that was the beginning of 30 years working with him at The Voice. It was the best gig I could have imagined.
So was he the first person who actually edited you then? If these pieces that you turned in on Sunday?
Because the Hollywood Reporter never edited me. Whatever I wrote went in there. And Downbeat, occasionally, they would cut out a line, or Dan Morganson, if he saw something tasteless, he would take it out, and I was occasionally tasteless. But he never called me. We never actually did an edit. So when I did my first, and at The Voice, I was never edited.
Yeah, you said just drop them in on a Sunday and they would come out.
They ran. And Diane, if Diane saw a sentence that she didn't like, she wouldn't call you and say, I don't understand this, or can we revise this? She wouldn't use the piece. So, in the whole year, she didn't use, I think, 3 pieces. And each time I said, how come you didn't use it? And it was always because of one line. I said, well, you could have taken the line out. She said, well, it doesn't matter. You had another piece in there anyway. So I was never edited. So my first piece with Bob, the editing was 2 hours. It was grueling. I left shaken. I thought either I've completely I've forgotten how to write, or I didn't know if I was up for this. And I learned, I can't begin to say all the things I learned. Bob made me a writer.
He's a great editor. Yeah, he's a really great
the
sentence by
best
sentence
line
editor. Yeah.
Ever that I've ever worked with, and I've worked with so many at this point. I've had a few good ones, and quite a number of morons, but nobody like Bob. I think that one of the keys to being a great editor is to be so generous to the writer you're working with that you're not afraid to give up some good stuff that you might have used yourself. And Bob was like that. If there was a line in there that was sort of witty, he would say, this can be punched up. And it became this real collaboration where we would sit there and think, how can we make this sentence ring? Because Bob is, and he made me this way, he is addicted to the well-formed sentence.
Yeah.
We would debate over semicolon versus an em dash. Really argue about it. In fact, when he did a piece, and his usual editor wasn't there, and it was about jazz anyway, so he asked me to be the editor. So we reversed roles. He came over to my apartment instead of me going over to his, and he sat on the sofa with his headphones on, and I read the piece quite nervously, and the guy writes like an angel, and there were 2 things I could change. I saw, and the first one, he was a little argumentative, but then he agreed, and the other one was literally a punctuation mark, and I was so proud that I got him to change a punctuation mark. And then Joe Levy was the rock editor at that time, the music editor, and I said, I just edited Bob, and I've never seen a cleaner manuscript in my life. I said, is that the way he writes for you? And he said, pretty much.
Yeah. And I ran into him 2 days ago, and he still had headphones. Yeah, he listens to every record ever recorded. I think it's
over and over
again. Yeah. Can we go back a little bit farther? Because you said you had a whole year of these rejection slips. How did you reach the point where you were writing pieces to get rejection slips? What led to you wanting to write criticism?
Well, I was, I have to admit that it wasn't all criticism. I did write a couple of short stories.
I was wondering.
Yeah. We won't even go there. But there was a new fever going around in the music world. For example, Rolling Stone was fairly new. It was about 3-4 years old at this point. And it seemed to me that they needed me because it was a rock magazine, and shouldn't they have one guy telling their readership what jazz was? I mean, that just made sense to me. Well, my God, most of the rejection slips were cards or sorry or this. I actually got back this really insulting, unsigned card from some asshole who worked there about how much he hated jazz and fuck you. I mean, that was, to a 22-year-old who's looking for work, it was unbelievable to me. To this day, I wouldn't write for Rolling Stone if they offered me stock. So, there was a lot of that, and I went to Harper, I met an editor there. He said, sure, send me some pieces, and I had this thing about writing about spec, and so sometimes I didn't take them up on it, and then sometimes I would go to a club or something and get really turned on.
But what made you want to write criticism in the first place, then?
Well,
was it the music you were interested in and explaining it?
I mean, I was trained to be a literary critic. I mean, the idea of writing criticism really did begin with Dwight MacDonald's Esquire pieces. He was so witty and polished. I just loved the way he wrote. And Esquire in the early 60s was considered, it's hard to believe now, but mildly salacious because they had these Vargas drawings. Drawings, mind you, not photographs, of diaphanously draped women. And my father he subscribed, and he kept his Esquires in the closet behind his hat box, which made them very desirable. So one night when they went out, I got on a ladder and took down the Esquires to see what was so mysterious. And I opened up to the letters page, and I was 11 or 12. And this woman wrote this letter in which she excoriated Dwight MacDonald, who of course I'd never heard of, for his review of Ben-Hur. Dwight had made this observation that in American religious epics, the good guys, the heroes, no matter what country it takes place in, are always played by Americans, and the villains are always played by Brits. It's like we're always reenacting the Revolutionary War, which is a funny observation. And this woman went ballistic. She said, I didn't notice British or American accents. To me, it was like a documentary. It was so real. Ben-Hur. So I had just seen Ben-Hur with my family. We had, driven into Manhattan like so many families were doing to see Ben-Hur. And I didn't like the film, but I didn't know why. I just, everybody was going on how great it was, and I couldn't really put my finger on it. So after I read that letter, I went through all the Esquires to find MacDonald's review. And man, it was like the veil. I had never encountered a sensibility like that, because most criticism was fan material. That's what you read in the newspapers. Don't miss Ben-Hur. The critics were more pious than the movies. And this guy was like 8 steps behind with very clear vision. I mean, even if you didn't agree with him, he was his own man. And I just loved, I was a voracious reader, but I had never encountered the critical sensibility. It was a good place to start.
Yeah.
And then right after that, I became fascinated. I discovered Edmund Wilson, classics and commercials, The Shores of Light. I started reading criticism I picked up Aldous Huxley's Literature and Science, which turned out to be his last book, marveling at the way he wrote about Eliot and the way he wrote about Keats, just almost in passing. And I still thought I was going to be a fiction writer, right through high school and into college. And then my senior year, I had a short story writer named Mike Lieberman. He was the greatest teacher I ever had. And he had won a couple of O. Henry Awards. He'd only published in his life 10 or 11, maybe a dozen short stories. That was it. And several nonfiction books about writing that the publisher perished thing that he had to write that we used as textbooks. And for one of his writing classes, I had done a lot of critical essays for him on literary subjects. He wrote a wonderful book on Catherine Ann Porter. He really made me into a Porterphile. But for this class, I wrote a short story. And he handed it back with some grunts. He was a tough guy and told me to rewrite it. And I did, and I never heard from him again. Now, this was 1970 when Kent State happened. A couple days ago was the anniversary. So Grinnell College, where I went in Iowa, closed down its facilities. They took a full-page ad in the Times saying, declaring solidarity with the fallen students at Kent State, and gave all of us 48 hours to get out of town, literally to leave Grinnell, unless we were off campus. And since I was a senior, I was off campus, so I wasn't rushed. So I met with Lieberman at the student union to do we had to do oral comprehensives, and my 3 subjects were Hemingway, Eliot, and Edmund Wilson, as critics in each case.
Hemingway, too.
Hemingway, absolutely, for what he wrote in Green Hills of Africa, and all those comments that became quoted by everybody.
Yeah.
He said Taras Bulba's the greatest. Taras Bulba's the greatest. Yeah. He's the one who made the line about Mark Twain. I mean, yeah. So we're sitting there, and I'm talking about Wilson, Eliot, and Hemingway, and he said, "Oh, you know this stuff. Let's talk about something else." And I said, "Well, you never got back to me about my short story." And he said, they used to call students Mr. in those days. He said, "Well, Mr. Giddins, there was really nothing to say about it. It was just awful. And if I were you, I would never write a short story again. Unless, of course, you're completely committed, in which case you really shouldn't listen to anything I've said. But I will say this. I've been teaching here for 35 years, and you have more of a gift for critical writing than any student I've ever seen." That was the first time anybody had ever said anything to me like that.
Wow, yeah.
I mean, I floated out of there. I didn't care about the short story comments. I mean, I think I was like reborn.
That was really life-changing then.
That was life-changing, totally life-changing.
Would you have gone on writing short stories if
Maybe.
you hadn't had that conversation?
Maybe. I don't know. I mean, the other thing that took me off of fiction was Thomas Pynchon had published V.
Mm-hmm.
And that book really depressed me. I loved that book. And I just thought, it's a whole other level. I mean, who am I kidding? I can't do that. And, but criticism was something I never doubted myself on. When I was doing film and jazz simultaneously, I felt I had to make a decision because I felt like a dilettante going between them. And it wasn't a decision. There was no question about jazz, because my feeling was there were a lot of movie critics. They all had their opinions, but I wasn't adding anything except another opinion. But jazz, I really loathed most of what was written about it. And I really, it's just not the way I heard it. I really thought I had something to contribute. And there was another editor I'd met who said to me, you know so much about jazz, why are you fighting it? And that's when I went to see Dan Morgenstern at Downbeat. And Dan took one look at me and saw this, white middle-class hippie and thought, oh yeah, another guy who wants to write stories about Miles Davis. And I knew he was going to see that. And I also knew Dan's writing chapter and verse because I adored his work. So I gave him a fast shiv to the midsection. I said, I'd really like to write about Bobby Hackett, a very obscure figure that Dan loved. That got him up. So that's how that started.
How did you meet John Hammond? And maybe you should tell them a little bit who John Hammond is.
It's another serendipitous story of sorts. My mother called me one Sunday when I was at Grinnell in Iowa, and she said, have you ever heard of John Hammond? And I said, yeah, of course. He's a legendary talent scout, executive Columbia Records. Well, my parents were going to some kind of an affair, and she went to a dressmaker, and John's wife, Esme, was there. And they started talking about their kids. His son was John Hammond Jr., who went to Antioch and became a blues guitarist and singer. And my mother said something about, Gary's, all he talks about is jazz, he's obsessed with jazz. And Esme said, my husband practically invented jazz. Which is what they would say. They should talk. So I wrote John a short note, telling him that my mother had met his wife. And he wrote me back this long letter, which I still have. And he said, well, we should meet, come see me. The next break was Christmas. This was 69. So I went to see him, and he really did the number on me. I mean, he was trying to impress me, and he didn't have to do anything to impress me except show up. But he played me tapes that no one had ever heard by Artie Shaw and Big Joe Turner, and I mean, what a day that was. And then we went for lunch, and then we got into it was raining, and I was wearing a $30 trench coat. And he reached for his trench coat, it was just like mine. I was really impressed, except as he twirled it around, it was lined with mink. So we got into the limo. He was going to drive me back to my apartment, and as we passed the bank on the corner of 5th Avenue and 52nd Street, the entire square block is a bank. He said, that's where I grew up. I said, where, the bank? He said, yeah, that was our home. He was a Vanderbilt, and that was the Vanderbilt mansion. And he used to sneak out the back door and go up to Harlem. He was practically disowned because that was the music he loved, and that was the area. And then he used his fortune to, record Bessie Smith and Billie Holiday and a lot of others.
Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen.
Well, much later, Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen, Stevie Ray Vaughan. I mean, he was a phenomenal guy. So we had this wonderful day, and then he said to me, look, there has to be a place for you at Columbia Records. Come see me when you graduate. So as soon as I graduated, I go up there, and the first thing he said to me is, refresh my memory, were you graduating high school or college? And then he I don't know, I can't explain it to this day, but he kept making appointments with me. I'd go up there, I would sit there from 9 to 5. It was like going to work. I'd just sit there. I remember Mitch Miller, of all people, walked in one day, and he did a double take when he saw me, and he said, things can't be that bad. And I had literally weeks and weeks, and his secretary would come out apologetically and say, John, had these meetings, and she would always come up with these lines. I became very friendly with her, and eventually with John over the years, but these few weeks were poisonous. And then one day, I asked to use the men's room, and inadvertently discovered that the way Black Rock is built, I thought, there's no way he could get out without passing me. Not true. There's a back way, a whole other bank of elevators. So I thought, oh, the hell with this. He's just sneaking out. So I went out and I rang for the elevator. It opens up, and who is there but John Hammond? And he said, oh, Gary, I'm so glad to see you. That's the way he talked. He says, and that's when he had said to me, how would you like to do a liner note? We're putting out a record by Michael Bloomfield. Wonderful, marvelous guitar player. I said, if I can do it anonymously, John, I'll do it. And
why did you want to do it anonymously?
Because I didn't know very much about Mike Bloomfield. It was strictly for the $100. I didn't want to, what if I didn't like the record?
Right.
I didn't want my name attached to something that might just be hack work. Then I didn't see him for a couple of years, and then I had all these pieces on The Voice, and then all of a sudden he's calling me. It's like I had now had some reputation in the jazz world, and that's when we became friends. He would call me up every time he got a recording, and I'd have to stop whatever I was doing, take the subway up to Black Rock. I still respected him beyond belief, so I was always happy to do this. One day, this is a true story, he called me up. He said, you must come up immediately. I have something you must hear. You must hear it right now. And I get up there, and he says, this is the most marvelous thing I've ever heard. Her name is Ursula Dudziak. She's from Poland, and we're going to sign her. And this is a record she made in Poland. And he puts on the turntable, and it's... And it goes on like that for a long time, and I listened for about... I was, going to out-listen him. As long as it was playing, I would just sit there and listen to it. And after 3 or 4 minutes, he took off the stylus. He said, well, what'd you think? And I said, being a coward, I said, it's interesting. At which point he turned to the phone, called up Goddard Lieberson, who I don't know if you know that name, but he was the president of Columbia Records. He's one of the major figures in the history of the recording industry. And he said, Goddard, I have Gary Giddins of the Village Voice here in my office. He thinks it's the most wonderful thing he's ever heard. That's how we got Ursula Dudziak signed to the label. It turned out he didn't really want Ursula. He wanted her husband, Michael Urbaniak, who is a very good fusion violinist who ended up making a lot of money for Columbia.
And that's very funny. When you do a book review or a film review or a music review, do you approach them very differently? And are they very different writing experiences for you?
I've spent a lot of time thinking about that, and the more I think about it, the less sure I am. When I was at The Voice in 1990, the film critic Jim Hoberman, another critic I admire enormously, took a year off to write a book. And he asked me to sit in for him. He knew I'd written about movies over the years and about my Hollywood Reporter escapade. And you should ask me why I got fired from the Hollywood Reporter.
Okay.
So he asked me to do the film criticism for a year. And so it was an incredible year for me because I wrote a full film column every week. And then I wrote a jazz column every month. So there were, altogether, I published like 64 columns that year. It was unbelievable, but it was, it was exciting. And I noticed after just a couple of months that usually I'd usually write on a Wednesday morning. I'd try to begin by 9:30, and I'd finish usually a jazz column by 3 or 4. But the film column I'd finish by like 1 or 2, much easier. And I realized that when you're writing about books or film, there's so much concrete material that takes up space. The plot and who the actors are and who directed it and what the photography looks like. Whereas with music, you're really floating on air with every sentence. I mean, once you've said what the tune is and who the musicians are, it's very impressionistic writing. I mean, for me it is.
Yeah.
And so you're spending a lot more time trying not to repeat yourself, not to use words like, I don't know, beautiful or great or superb or sublime or all those terrible cliches. You're always looking for what makes this piece beautiful as opposed to all the other pieces. With film, I don't know, it just seemed easier, much more natural. When I left The Voice and started writing about, when I went to the New York Sun, I did not want to ever again be a reviewer of new films because, as I read that, it is corrosive to the soul to have most of what you see is such junk, and you resent the imposition on your time, and then writing about it, it's like no one's ever going to see this movie. One of the critics I never liked, and I always get into arguments about this, but when I taught criticism at Columbia, I always used Pauline Kael as my goat. As an example, I'd bring in a piece as an example of everything not to do, from the imperial we to the predictability, the arrogance. But Pauline Kael used to write 4,000 and 5,000 word reviews of movies she despised. I could never figure that out. James Agee would do a sentence. That's all that was really necessary. I wouldn't do that. So I said, look, I want to do the same column I did about jazz. And I can do that now because of DVDs. This way I can sort of maneuver through the space and time and write about classic films and whatever I feel like writing about, as opposed to having to write what's opening up on Friday. So when I got into that, I found that the deeper I got into the subject, suddenly those reviews became more time-consuming to write because I was researching, I was becoming obsessed in a different way. The way I did with jazz, which was if I was writing about a John Ford movie, I had to rewatch every John Ford movie. If I was writing about John Huston or Lubitsch or whoever it was, I was really girding myself with material the way I would do when I wrote the jazz column.
Before I ask you about how you were fired from the Hollywood Reporter, how did you research the Peep Show piece? Like, how did you come to that?
That, again, serendipity. I had basically put this book together. I had revised all the essays, which make up 90% of the contents. But I had promised my publisher that I would write this long introductory essay, and I'd been working on, I couldn't come up with something. I was really defeated by it, and I was running out of time. I needed to get it done within a week, like 12,000 word piece at least. So it was a beautiful weekend afternoon. I said to my wife, let's take a walk. And I think I'd already got the idea about exhibition, and I had read somewhere that in some film history that the first kinetoscopes were shown on Broadway in Lower Manhattan. And we started to walk up Broadway to 27th Street, and I started asking people if they knew, people who worked in these buildings, how old the buildings were. I was trying to see if I could nail down what building, because none of the histories said which storefront it was. And the only one that seemed possible to me was the hotel. And the hotel, they thought I was, I don't know what, the FBI or something. They could not wait to get me out of the lobby. They were lying. Oh, no, we did this one was built 5 years ago. It's around the building. You know. So, but with that suspicion, I then Googled 1155 Broadway and finally found an old piece in the Times from, I don't know, the early part of the century, talking about the opening. And then with that in mind, I went back there and started making notes about the block. I don't know, that was the inspiration I needed. The rest just came like falling off a wall.
So it's very personal.
Oh, yeah.
So how were you fired from the Hollywood Reporter?
Okay, I'd been at the Hollywood Reporter, turning out these pieces, $5 a review. I was still working at the Post most of that time, but I got them to switch me to the morning shift so that I got out at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I'd take the subway uptown and could make a 2:30 or 3 o'clock screening. I'd write the piece by 6, 7 o'clock. They had an office on 42nd Street, and I forget what they're called, but you put them in a roller, and then the piece comes out in California. So you put the piece on some kind of a roller machine, and I forget how it worked. But this went on for a little over a year, and some of it was fun and some of it was deadly. And the way it worked was, if the movie screened first in Los Angeles, Arthur Knight, who lived out there, reviewed it. If it screened first in New York, I reviewed it. Lady Sings the Blues was about to open from Paramount, which was a biography, an alleged biography of Billie Holiday, based on the book Lady Sings the Blues, which is really written by a guy named Bill Dufty, as told to by Billie Holiday. And I called up Paul Sergeant Clark, my editor, and I said, I know something about jazz and about Billie Holiday, and I'd really like to do this movie. And he said, well, let me ask Arthur. And Arthur didn't care, and he said, go do it. So I wrote the review. I didn't expect the movie to be good, but I didn't expect it to be as ferociously libelous and offensive as it turned out to be. I mean, clearly the movie was made by Motown as a vehicle for Diana Ross. But my feeling was, if you're making a movie about Billie Holiday, it should be about Billie Holiday, not about Diana Ross. You should be hearing Billie Holiday's voice, or at least someone who tries to sing like Billie Holiday. The plot was completely ludicrous. It was demeaning to everybody involved. And there was a scene in it in which she's turned on to drugs by the white band leader she's working with. And the only white band leader she worked with was Artie Shaw. So that really was libelous. And later, when I got to know Artie, he told me he went to see it. He lived in California, but he was in New York. And he went by himself to some Broadway theater, and he said, I walked out. I was crying so hard I didn't see where I was for 5 blocks. I don't mention his name, but, anybody who knew anything. So anyway, I wrote this review. I get a call from Paul Clark, and he says, Paramount is threatening to withhold all advertising for 2 months unless we run another review. I said, well, that's your call. It has nothing to do with me. And he said, the problem is, I asked Arthur Knight to go out and look at it, and Arthur came back and said, I'm not going to review it. Gary's right. The film's an abomination. So what the head of the Hollywood Reporter did was fire Paul Clark, the head of the New York office, and myself. They wouldn't say why, they wouldn't admit it, but that was a good life lesson.
Yeah. The last question I'll ask before we turn to the audience for some questions. In my introduction, I talked about sentences, and you write these amazing sentences. And is writing, is criticism for you mainly writing, or is it more about what you're writing about, or can you tell those two things apart?
I think I'm concentrating on the idea. That's all I'm really thinking about. After a while, I think writers have an innate style. I had a style when I started, but it was embryonic. I mean, writing a lot is what brings it out. Working with a good editor like Bob Briscoe helps bring it out. All of these things sharpen you. Writing for the last 6 years without a line editor has sharpened me because I've got no net. Before I could take chances, and I knew Bob, if I did something stupid, would save me. Now, I can't take that chance anymore. So I'm much more conscious about the sentences when I'm rereading the finished piece. But when I'm writing, I'm never thinking about that. I'm only thinking about the ideas that generate the piece. Why am I enthusiastic? Why am I anxious? If I'm not, or happy to be writing this, if I'm not, if I don't give a shit, then it has the feeling of hack work. Then it's like, oh, I got to turn out 1,500 words, and I don't want to do this. Yeah. But if it's, but I don't allow myself that to happen anymore. I mean, one of the privileges, you reach a certain age, is you just say, that's it. I'm not doing any more hack work for anybody, no matter what. And I mean, when I worked for The Sun, my wife thought I was crazy because they were paying me virtually nothing. But they were letting me have space, and they were letting me do exactly what I wanted. Nobody was looking over my shoulder, and it was worth it to me. And this is the result of that. This and actually both of these books. So,
Were you aware at all that you were writing books?
I never know at the time what is going to stand up well enough to go into a book or not. I mean, you have an idea in the back of your head, but when I've collected essays, sometimes it's painful because I'll read a whole bunch of stuff in a row that's just awful. What was I going through then? Or else it may be perfectly good as journalism. It was written for a magazine or a newspaper rather, so it served its purpose then. But it's nothing you'd put in a book. But then you find other pieces that really stand up, and those are the pieces that you're proud of.
How different is your process when you're actually writing something that you know is a book, like the Satchmo book or Bing Crosby?
I mean, right now I'm a full-time book writer. That's all I'm doing. I'm writing volume 2 of my Bing Crosby biography. It's unnerving. Some days are good, many are not. But the Satchmo was an interesting project because it had to be done in a year, and I spent almost that much time researching, interviewing people, and I wrote the book in 3.5 weeks. I had an office a block from our apartment. And in those days, my daughter was born a couple of years after that book, so there was no children involved. And I used to write at night a lot because I would go to clubs and I'd be energized. And I loved. I had my typewriter, the window would here, my desk in front of it, and I loved watching the sun rise over my typewriter in the morning. So for this book, I literally would sleep all day. I'd meet my wife. It was her dinner, it was my breakfast. We'd meet in a cafeteria down the block. Other than that, I hardly saw her for 3.5 weeks. And then I'd go back and write all night and then sleep all day. I mean, that was it for 3.5 goddamn weeks. I mean, I don't know what it sounds like to you, but it's so amazing to me because when I look at the book, I just can't believe it. It was like automatic writing in a way. But on the other hand, I'd spent how much of my life obsessing about this guy?
Yeah.
And
that's what I was wondering. Just distilled everything.
Book.
Yeah, you distilled everything you knew into those 3 weeks.
It's really a critical argument in which I was trying to change the conversation about Armstrong away from the idea that he was this genius in 1928 who then somehow sold out and fell out of the clouds. My feeling was that in many ways he became a more sublime artist as he got older and did a lot of his greatest work right up through, and that to really appreciate Armstrong's achievement, and he really is the nucleus of American popular music and American art music and jazz. He influenced everything. He influenced the way trumpets are played in a symphony. But in order to really accept that, you have to accept him whole. And white critics, I mean, black critics went through a period when they were calling him an Uncle Tom, the smiling and all of that, but they got over that much faster than the white critics. The white critics were always writing about him as though they were slightly embarrassed. Gunther Schuller was the first in early jazz says that Armstrong is the greatest genius of the 20th century, the greatest genius American music has ever produced. And then he says the government should have given him a stipend so he shouldn't have to humiliate himself playing Hello Dolly. To me, that shows like no understanding of what his art is about, even though...
Or how culture works.
His understanding of the music in the 20s, is magnificent. I mean, Gunther is brilliant that way. He's a musicologist. He could analyze the solos and tell you things I could never have heard on my own. But, you know, Armstrong retired? I mean, Jesus, it's just unimaginable, you know. That's not what his music is about. His music is always about engaging the audience.
And the goal of the Crosby book is obviously changing the conversation, too.
Yeah, you know, the Crosby book was signed, it's supposed to be 300 pages in 3 years, and now it's been 18 years. The first volume was 700 pages, and the second volume will be at least that. Because it became not just about Crosby, but about the whole development of... when I started the book, I did not know about Bing's involvement in the technology, that he was the first guy to take a microphone out of a radio and put it on a stand on stage and sing into a microphone. I did not know that he was the man who had financed the invention of tape and changed the industry to a tape-based industry. I mean, I didn't know his, you know, he's reputed to be this, you know, extremely wealthy sort of Republican conservative guy, but was so far ahead of the curve on civil rights. I mean, he supported the Scottsboro Boys. He was, you know, lost a radio show because he insisted not only on having black performers on the air all the time, which was not unusual, but at performing with them, which was very unusual. I mean, he was a guy who did not negotiate about anything. He just did what he thought was right. Maybe it wasn't always, but on civil rights, he was. I mean, that's one of the reasons he had the relationship with Armstrong. And when Armstrong died and New Orleans couldn't raise the money to build a statue, he gave him a blank check. Bing said that my single favorite line about Armstrong. To me, it's so profound because it just shows the depth of his understanding. He said, Louis Armstrong is the beginning and the end of music in America. You know, later on, when he was asked to elaborate, he said, do you realize, he was talking to Joey Bushkin, he said, a great pianist, he said, do you realize that Louis Armstrong is the greatest singer that ever lived and ever will live forever and ever? And Bushkin said, well, you know, we all idolize Pops, but what are you thinking of? He said, it's so simple. When he sings a happy song, you laugh. When he sings a sad song, you cry. He said, what the hell else is there in pop music?
Any questions from out here? Don't be intimidated by the microphone.
How did you get turned on to jazz?
I'm sorry?
How did you get turned on to jazz? As a child, very early?
Yeah, again, it's pure serendipity. I grew up listening mostly to classical music and rock and roll. Classical music was something that you listened to secretly. You did not want your friends to know. It was, you know, but rock and roll, I also loved 50s rock and roll. I loved Little Richard, Chuck Berry, those guys. And in the late 50s, early 60s, every single major figure, I mean, I can hardly think of an exception in rock and roll, disappeared. I mean, the country hated it. And some of them, I mean, Elvis went into the army. Chuck Berry was arrested on a violation of the Mann Act. Little Richard turned to gospel. Jerry Lee Lewis was blacklisted for marrying his 13-year-old cousin. Sam Cooke and Jackie Wilson were both shot. Fats Domino got in trouble with the mafia and had to play in Las Vegas casinos for the rest of his life. Lloyd Price got in trouble with the mafia and his partner was murdered and he disappeared. I mean, every single guy Bo Diddley was blacklisted by Ed Sullivan because he wouldn't play 16 tons on the Sunday night program. And worse than that, they were replaced by these parody acts, these white 16-year-olds who couldn't sing, like Fabian and Frankie Avalon and Ned. I don't know if you ever heard of these people, but it was painful. I mean, you turned on the radio that used to be about, you know, Johnny Be Good, and now it was Turn Me Loose by Fabian. I met the drummer who was on that record, and he said we did 42 takes, and he never could get it right, and it's only 1 minute and 42 seconds. So I was looking for something. I still had classical music, but I was looking for something else. And jazz seemed very complicated to me. But Ray Charles in 1962 made a record called Genius Plus Soul Equals Jazz. Everybody loved Ray Charles. He was the one guy who still survived. And so I figured, okay, let me hear some jazz. And before I did anything about it, I was in New Orleans that summer with a bunch of kids. And on a Sunday afternoon, I said, I tried to get somebody to go with me to a jazz club, just as a tourist, see it. That's what you do in New Orleans. You go to hear jazz. Nobody would go. Finally, I found one kid, and we went to the Royal Orleans Hotel. And when I walked in, this was at the height of the Civil Rights era. The hotel we were at had 4 doors when you arrived: men, women, colored women. It was unbelievable. And I walked into the Royal Orleans Hotel, and I saw something I'd never seen in New York. Completely integrated crowd. Adult men and women, white and black, smoking, drinking, listening to this great black band. And I thought, not only is the music staggering, but the whole enlightenment that I attached to jazz, I just thought, wow, this is the world I want to be a part of. And when I got back, I just started to, I bought Downbeat. I wanted to hear everything I could. And then when I discovered Armstrong's 1928 recordings, that was it. Because my favorite piece of music growing up was the B minor Mass. I used to play that to death, the Carrie Eliezer. And when I heard the Armstrong, Muggles and West End Blues and tight like that, that was the first music I'd ever heard that made me feel the way Bach did. And I thought, do people know this? That there's this Bach in the culture? So that, in a sense, also made me want to write about it eventually, because my feeling from most of the criticism was that most people didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things that really strikes me about your work is that you have an appreciation for such a range of different styles of jazz that, writing about like Albert Ayler it wouldn't occur to me that would be an extension of an early interest in the New Orleans jazz. How do you kind of thread this whole world together?
Well, that's what I loved about jazz when I finally started listening to it. I mean, every record I bought was so different from every other record, whereas all rock and roll basically sounded like rock and roll. And on some level, most 19th century classical music was recognizable as such. But, if you bought a Benny Goodman record and an Ornette Coleman record and a Horace Silver record, they were really far apart. Nobody would listen to all 3 and say jazz. You might say it about any one of them, but you couldn't even find anybody who would listen to all 3. There were swing fans, there were bebop fans. So this, to me, this is all jazz. This is what excited me about it. So as I started listening, and reading about it, I started filling in the blanks. These are the guys from the 20s, the 30s, the 40s. And you began to realize that each movement is totally in sync with what's going on. That only in the Depression, the age of Fred and Ginger movies, could you have anything as almost ludicrously opulent as the big bands. Only in the 40s, the late 40s, the noir era, could you have something as dark and fragmented as bebop. Only during the Civil Rights era could you have something as angry and occasionally hysterical as the avant-garde. And so all of this, the way jazz interacts with the society, reflects the society, influences society, was completely fascinating to me. The down part of it was that I was so obsessed that I didn't listen to any pop from 63 on. I mean, I didn't even watch the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. It just wasn't in my... when I started dating a couple of years ago, I started going out with girls, it was like, oh, yeah, I have to listen to this if I'm going to get laid. But other than that, I had no interest in rock and roll. I was wrong. I mean, now when I look back and I think, why was I so disliking it? Because some of it's really interesting in terms of the jazz influence, which now you can't, you can't mistake. The first time I ever really listened to Abbey Road and I heard the way those bass lines were written, I was like, whoa, these guys are serious. So that was a mistake. But on the other hand, you can only do so much, and jazz is, I mean, today, remember when I started listening was in the 60s, and the history of jazz was only 40 years old. Now it's twice that. It'd be difficult for a young person to grasp all of it. It is so, and then the international aspect of it, because there are kinds of jazz in Eastern Europe, for example, and in Japan, that are not just imitation American. It's exciting because it reflects their culture. It's a whole different way of listening. And Americans are so prejudiced against foreign jazz because it doesn't move the same kind of way. So it's really an enormous planet, jazz. I mean, you could spend your whole life trying to come to grips with Ellington, just Ellington, the 3,000 recordings of Ellington. I mean, there's no other body of work. First of all, it's so huge, and Ellington was, you know, he was crazy. I mean, every time he recorded a tune, he would revise it. I mean, it's unbelievable the changes he would make. So, you know, it's a really big subject. When I teach jazz, the first thing I want to make very clear to the students is, you know, do not think because the library of jazz books is, you know, cover this room, it's still virgin territory. There still aren't really great jazz biographies of hardly anybody. There's still so much material. And then also every generation has to rediscover it. Because my take on Coleman Hawkins, which is based partly on actually seeing him, is going to be very different from yours. If you're just discovering him now, it's going to be through ears that have been tempered by, I don't know, hip-hop or pop music, whatever it is that you've grown up with, modern classical music. You're going to hear things that I never heard. I have to tell you, this morning, a friend of mine came over and he said, do you have Ben Webster's Ash? And I said, what is that? He said, it's a 1958 recording. It's on the soul of Ben Webster. I said, I'm sure I have it. He said, we'll take it out. You have to listen to the piano solo, so I put it on. It's probably a record I haven't played in 20 years. And we're listening to the piano solo, and all of a sudden, it's like an in-joke that 6 people on earth would have gotten. But it goes into, they just turn the rhythm around, and they start quoting George Russell's Concerto for Billy the Kid. Now, I would never have heard that, except that I've been really studying George Russell in the last few years. You know, you just constantly hearing things in a different way.
One more question? Because some people have an 8 o'clock class, and that's in another building today. No? No? Well, that brings it to a close, and please join me in thanking Gary.